and votes out McGraw. McGraw wins with McGraw loses with 49.9% of the vote. Okay, and the new fellow who succeeds McGraw, Justice Benjamin, gets on the court and rules, participates in the decision, and rules in favor of Massey Coal and says, Caperton, you can't have the $50 million all the other courts were going to give you because you're wrong and Massey's right. And so Caperton takes this case to the US Supreme Court by the time he gets done, and he says, hey court, you know, he had a conflict. And they say, no, there wasn't an actual conflict because this was corporate money given in what's now McCain-Feingold soft money style, right? It was an issue ad about him, and it wasn't given to Blankenship's campaign. I didn't give any personal money to Blankenship. I gave personal money to my own campaign committee that campaigned against Blankenship's opponent. So there's no conflict. You know, how many times have we heard this in our Wisconsin Supreme Court recently? You know, this was like deja vu at the time. Well, anyway, in that case, it was one glimmer of hope for our Supreme Court because the four liberal justices, at the time it was Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and who am I missing? If anybody can think of, oh, I know, Breyer, were joined by Justice Kennedy. And Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion saying, hey, there is a probability of bias that is shown here, that it is acute. Indeed, it is way over the top. And so as a result, Justice Benjamin, you must recuse yourself and send this back down. So that is our one brief glimmer of hope in the US Supreme Court in terms of where they think you can actually draw the line with all this money. That being said, I just want to talk for a few minutes on how this plays out in reality. And you have seen it up here in some of the more highly financed campaigns you've had recently, and you're going to see it again in these recall elections. But the reality is that in Wisconsin, we have done very little to make these private entities doing independent expenditures accountable. While they may need to tell us what their committee is called, you know, the committee, you always know the Committee for Good Government is really the Committee for Bad Government, right? I mean, this is how these work, right? So anyway, you know, the Committee for Brighter Futures for Wisconsin's Children is really the committee to eviscerate all of public education, right? Okay, so we're all on the same page on that. So these committees, you know, those of us who are kind of what their names say, because there's no truth in advertising kind of requirement placed on these committees, which I always found funny because the Republicans, you know, always get mad about what we do with, you know, truth in advertising for businesses. And then they tell us that they want us to run the government more like a business. So you'd think that these campaign committees could be truth in advertising too, but they don't. So that being said, the next step though is that the Supreme Court case in Citizens United, the one thing it does allow is for us as governments and for campaign organizations, Government Accountability Board or whatever, to also require that those committees tell us who's given them the money. You know, who are your major contributors? But folks are reluctant to do that, and we can't get the votes. Well, why can't we get the votes? We can't get the votes because the people electing our government with money are the people who are paying that money to elect that government. And so, you know, then you get this circular downhill kind of thing going where the people who are dumping all this money in campaigns are getting their folks elected because they've dumped so much money into it. And then pretty soon you have the people who, you know, so they don't want to vote against these folks and they want to continue with this process because it inures to their benefit. So, you know, that's kind of the bad way it happens. And I get to see this in my everyday life quite often, at least my everyday work life these days. I happen to be a lawyer these days in private practice, and while my biggest client and my major focus these days has been for AFSCME Council 24, Wisconsin State Employees Union, yay, our good state employees who are working without a contract. 24 folks here? Okay, we gotta get there. I think they gotta get them to these meetings, okay. Anyway, that being said, these folks, that's my main thing, but my second other thing I do is I work for the Service Employees International Union, in large part because it is the one international union that very ardently opposed McCain, or opposed the Citizens United stuff, and came out in favor of McCain-Feingold and always has. But anyway, it's interesting because among the things I do for them is work with incumbent state attorneys general. And since the incumbent state attorneys general all know my politics, I tend to work with the Democratic Republican state attorneys general, which is an incredible personal loss to me that I don't get to talk to these folks. But, and there are a ton of things that are going on with state attorneys general that impact all of our everyday lives. For example, attorneys general from almost 40 of the states in the last half decade or a little more have been suing pharmaceutical companies for violating what they call average wholesale pricing laws. We were the first state when I was AG to take actions against, I think we took actions against 19 pharmaceutical companies. But states and throughout the nation, and Republican as well as Democratic state AGs have continued to prosecute these cases, and they get hundreds of millions of dollars back for their states because based on these fraudulent practices, we pay too much money to these companies to cover prescriptions for Medicare and Medicaid, okay? So the state loses. Plus, if the state has its own health plan or plans that its employees use, we lose on that too because we're paying too much money on those. So we're getting these awards. Nationwide, there are these awards being made of, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them have been like 750, that's wrong, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of dollars, excuse me. But we've had one award that with one pharmaceutical company that will pay out over $1 billion to all the states combined on prescription drug fraud. This is money we paid into the healthcare system in some way, shape, or form that they have and none of us do, right? Anyway, so they're doing all these cases, and a lot of them settle out of court because they take forever to try, and it would make recounts look like they were even faster than Mary claims they are. And anyway, so what do the pharmaceutical companies do? They go to all the fundraisers of the Democratic AGs because they know they're the ones holding out the longest for the best deals on these cases. And they start giving them money. There's one Democratic AG in the country who had a fundraiser during a national Democratic AG event. And in one evening alone, he pulled in $750,000, mostly from pharmaceutical companies, for his campaign for state AG in a small, a small state in south central US. Now, if they're dumping that much money into the Democrats' campaigns, think of what they're dumping into the Republicans. And from what little we do know with statistics, it shows that they're dumping anywhere from 2 to 6 times as much money into the Republican campaigns. Okay? So what does this tell us about Citizens United? And these are AGs. These are not US senators. This is not the presidential race. This is not, any of this. That right now in the United States, there are about, I don't know if there are 4 or 5 now, I'm a little out of date, big nursing home chains that control most of the nursing homes. And they have 2 goals. One is to get rid of publicly run nursing homes. And the second goal is to eat up and buy all the little locally owned nursing homes. And together, these competitors that are giants work together in terms of getting rid of the little guys so they can simply compete against each other. And if you look at their contributions, they too do the same things. And they max out to the candidates, and then what do? They use soft money creations in order to dump that extra money that they can't give under the campaign finance laws. So they go to, like in the case of Democrats, and they aren't rich compared to the other side, they go to the Democratic AG's Association and they give money there. Or they maybe give money to a political party. But what we're seeing on the political right is that they're not just doing that, we're trying to do this defensively and come up with what we can, and getting kind of the beggar handouts from these groups that have a ton of money, and then trying to get our own friends to help coordinate and control and do things strategically well, so even though we have less money, we do it better. But what they're doing with the Republican side of the equation is they have these huge pots of money in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and some of these committees you've heard of, and Dave's nodding his head because you know just what I mean. And they will sit here and they will look, they'll look nationally and they'll say, wait, these are the states we need, and this is where we think we can win. And the week before the election, suddenly, $5 million comes into your state.